We will go on to the next session. It's a session on networks. It's a session on the importance of networks. Can international networks promote cultural diversity and intercultural dialogue on a local level? And how does that really work? And to help us with understanding both the complexity of the curatorial networks, international curatorial networks, and how they work, and how this might be able to happen, we have two experts with us. First, we will hear from María del Carmen Carrión, who is originally born in Ecuador but works in and out of New York since 3 years back.
Yes.
María is Director of Public Programs and Research at ICI, the Independent Curators International, which is also based in the US. And next to María is Kati Kivinen. And Kati is curator at KIASMA. KIASMA is one of the more significant contemporary arts museums in Northern Europe. And besides that, KIASMA in Helsinki in Finland, and besides being a curator at KIASMA, Kati is the Vice President of IKT, the International Association of Curators of Contemporary Art. So even though we killed contemporary yesterday, she will still be allowed to kind of have that as part of her luggage. So first out will be María and then Kati, and we will do exactly as we did before, 2 consecutive presentations, and then we will go into a dialogue, and once again, it will be very great to have you on board in that dialogue. So please, María.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, my first time in Copenhagen. I want to thank the organizers for the invitation. I'm going to be reading, so bear with me. I'm here with you this afternoon to speak about Independent Curators International, ICI, and its curatorial network. ICI was founded in 1975 by Nina Castelli-Sandell and Susan Sollins as a pioneer organization devoted to support the work of curators and as an organization that will allow for global collaborations to take place in what at the time they already foresaw as an increasingly internationally art world. ICI has been headquartered in New York City since its founding 40 years ago, but from the start it has worked at an international level. The scope of its programs have changed responding to the expanding and changing role of the curator and to the needs of the international audiences that ICI works for. We produce exhibitions, events, publications, as well as research and training opportunities for curators and for diverse audiences around the world. The core question that I have been asked to address today is how international curatorial networks can enhance intercultural dialogue. I would like to tackle this challenge by presenting to you a low-cost training program for emerging curators that ICI started in 2010, the Curatorial Intensive Program. The Curatorial Intensive allows curators to connect with peers and mentors and to reflect on their practice while supporting the development of an exhibition idea or program. This could be a publication, a series of educational programs, the development of a new institution, etc. The program is a short duration workshop, between 7 to 8 days, depending on where we do it, where curators take part of seminars, site visits, group discussions, and individual and group advising sessions. Emerging and mid curators that have at least 3 years of experience are invited to apply to the program through an open call that then is juried by a group of professionals in the field. We have organized 26 programs in these 5 years, and we currently have around 330 alumni from 65 different countries and 21 US states. Them, alongside the faculty that has taught in the different iterations of the program, constitute the network I would like to speak about this afternoon. My aim is to present to you our network and its strengths and particularities in a tangential way. I will speak about the specifics of the curatorial intensive, and by doing that, I hope that you will gain an understanding of the kind of network that we're creating and nurturing through this program. So the curatorial intensive. One of the things that make it different to other training programs that exist around the world is that this is a mobile platform of global reach. We have conducted workshops in Ciudad de Mexico, Bogotá, and Buenos Aires. Those 3 taking place entirely in Spanish, and we're actually going back next month to Bogotá, so we are trying to go back to some places that we have already been to really go a little bit deeper and create bigger connections. We have also done programs in Johannesburg, Addis Ababa, and last week in Marrakesh. This last program was held in English and French. We have also done and continue to do programs in Europe, Asia, and the United States. Up to last year, the program took place twice a year in New York City, but since January of this year, we decided to start organizing programs also in different cities in the US with the collaboration of local partners. This past January, we conducted a program in New Orleans in collaboration with CCA New Orleans and with Prospect New Orleans, the biennial. For the local partners, both nationally and internationally, the program is a great opportunity to nurture the art ecosystem by training the next generation of curators. It also offers the possibility of finding out who are the new critical minds of the next generation and to invite them to work with them. For us at ICI, having local partners is an essential component to the program. It locates the dialogue with the local conversation, within the local conversation. It opens up the scope of collaborators because we find out through our partners who are some of the thinkers, who are some of the writers, art historians, artists that are working at the local level that we are not aware of. So this is our opportunity to really learn from their expertise and to share forms of practices. So it's always a challenge, it's always exciting, and having a collaborator that is local kind of keeps us on our feet. We do a lot of thinking in New York among ourselves, but the moment we expand that conversation to our collaborators is always a great opportunity to rethink certain elements of the program. I would like to note that many of the places that we go to don't have an academic program for curatorial training. So the intensive is groundbreaking in many regions, in the sense that it provides curators that can afford to travel or to enroll in an academic program a possibility to engage on a curatorial discourse with mentors and peers. Its itinerant aspect allows to multiply the sites where the engagement and discussion of curatorial discourse takes place, beyond places that might have more solvent infrastructures and academic programs. By taking the conversation to these alternate sites, we make it viable for many curators that, due to visa restrictions, will find it hard or impossible to secure visas to travel to Europe or to the United States, to meet with peers and to present their ideas. It seems like it's not so much of a radical action, but the fact that it's extremely hard to find visas, like when you hold an Ecuadorian passport, like I do, even to come to Europe, it's quite remarkable that the fact that if you move around and you do programs in certain locations is going to be much easier for people that are based and that hold a passport from certain nations to be able to join the program. It is also quite significant that each iteration of the program brings together a very diverse group of curators to the discussion. I want to talk a little bit about the Marrakesh program, this one that we just ended on Monday, because I think that one is a great case study. It's a program that had 13 participants coming from 11 countries. We had curators from Morocco, Turkey, Portugal, the UK, Ghana, Zimbabwe, Spain, Nigeria, Pakistan, South Africa, and Tunisia. Some of them were living and working in places far away from their country of origin, including New York, Dubai, Brumadinho in Brazil. This also meant that among the majority of the conversations, that although the majority of the conversations took place in English and French, and that implied a great share of translation between the two languages, there was a total of 19 languages spoken around the table. And I'm just going to list them because I did a little survey to try to find out where people were coming from in terms of the way they were thinking and the way they were mentally translating on top of the translation that we were already having. And these 19 languages are Arabic, Spanish, Catalan, French, Portuguese, English, Turkish, Ndebele, Shona, Twi, Ga, German, Afrikaan, Urdu, Jugrati, Bini, Urobo, Ishan, and Shekiri, sorry. You were saying over lunch that language creates reality, and I agree with that because it really shows that a mental space and a way of understanding the world, like a cultural framework. So having this diversity of languages spoken around the table really it speaks about the diversity of thinking that a program like the Curatorial Intensive has. That extraordinary diversity of spoken languages point to the richness of cultural perspective and to the complexities that were put on the table, and to the incredible amount of cultural translation that took place during the week. I would like to emphasize these aspects since translation and accessibility is something that we're particularly invested in. Most of our training programs are highly international, with participants joining from different corners of the world. This implies a great deal of cultural translation, as I said before, but also implies that we need to understand the specificity of the different contexts represented by participants and faculty. And this means that sometimes the conversations take a really long time to unravel, because one word can trigger a number of concepts that are dealt in a different way in the different places. It also means that we don't believe that the curatorial discourse has an Anglo-Saxon prerogative. We have been very careful in choosing the language we run our programs when we go to a non-English-speaking country. We have realized programs entirely in Spanish and partially in French. This is a conscious political decision that reflects on the richness of place and language, but also that avoids closing down the conversation or limiting the preview of it. To accomplish realizing the program in another language besides English also means that we have and that we will be translating texts about curatorial discourse. At the moment only exists in English. We are currently on the final editing stage of a reader with curatorial texts that haven't been translated to Spanish and that we produced for the first intensive that we did in Spanish in Buenos Aires 3 years ago. And we're looking forward to translating a number of texts into Arabic. This is a program conceived for professional curators, which, again, it can change depending on the context, that are interested in sharing their experience with curators that have different levels of expertise, who are invited to the program to present their past projects and methodologies, while also serving as a sounding board to the participants' ideas. It is a program that is built on generosity and that emphasizes horizontal learning and sharing. Therefore, the network we are creating is based on human bonding, shared intellectual investment in artistic practice, and the creation of audiences. It drives through the sharing of ideas, long-term conversations, and collaboration. We don't have an established curriculum. However, there is a sort of a hidden curriculum provided by the mentors that are invited to advise in the program that we carefully select for each one of the different programs that we do. With each of the mentors that are artists, curators, writers, it comes a diverse cultural landscape. We aim not to offer a singular vision of the curatorial, but a multiplicity of voices and approaches that speak to the diversity of the field. Another important element to this hidden curriculum is that we allow the different sides to inform our approaches and reflections. This comes from a desire to address the local and to learn from the specificity that cities and regions can provide. By default, this keeps us on track to avoid a parachuting effect or a club med that doesn't matter where we move, we have exactly the same discussion. We don't want to have a prepackaged program that lands and unfolds exactly the same without resonating with the local specificity and without allowing the diverse voices to raise their concerns and share their expertise. So I'm going to try to wrap it up, sharing with you why is it that we do this program and why are we so passionate about building this network. Many of the curators that take part of the program, whether they are coming from a new burgeoning art center like Bogota or from a mid-sized city in the Midwest of the USA, have mentioned in multiple occasions that they experience a sense of isolation in the development of their work. It might be that they are working for an institution where they feel the discussion about curatorial practice have little resonance or feedback, or because they are working independently, sometimes in places where there is little or no critical discourse. There is a strong desire to connect with fellow curators, to build a community, even if it's a temporary one, to understand the relevance of the work they are doing locally, by sharing and contrasting with the work produced by colleagues elsewhere, even to share frustrations, but also to dream together. We provide the opportunity for curators based in multiple locations to connect and exchange ideas, and to carve time in their busy production schedule to reflect on their practice and on the developments of the field. The topics of the discussions change for each program. They are shaped in part by the presentations the mentors bring, many times as case studies, but also by the questions the participants present to the group. In some occasions, we propose a topic-based intensive that connects to the site and allows us to better choose the speakers we invite and informs the curators that apply and get selected. For instance, we did a program a couple of years ago in Northern Ireland, in Londonderry, about curating in places of conflict. We provide a setting and a methodology that allows to spend time together, discussing the artisan ideas, posing critical questions about each other's practices, learning about the infrastructures and conditions of cultural production that exist in different contexts, and how the work of curators impact the field. To give you some examples of the topics participants are eager to engage, I should point that many are interested in discussions around exhibition models and the history of exhibition making, but that there is also an urgency to share and learn about forms of engagement with audience, about fundraising and the ethics behind it. And also there is a strong interest about recovering histories, establishing genealogies for contemporary artists and curators, and focusing on researching and presenting the practices of conceptual artists that have been forgotten or unwritten from history. I would like to emphasize that the platform we provide is not about creating a networking opportunity for the sake of it. Networking is not the goal of the program. It is not just about meeting people, but also about the possibility of establishing connections through shared interest that might develop into long-term collaborations. It is about providing a setting for the exchange of ideas, and hopefully for that exchange, a community will be formed that will serve as a support system, a place to get feedback, bounce ideas against, and avoid the sense of curators working on isolation. The Curatorial Intensive is the incubator for a growing international network, and we spend a lot of time thinking of ways to better help it grow, for better ways to support and create channels of communications. We have done this by offering funding via research fellowships, but lately also, we have been very happy to see that smaller networks of people that are part of the ICI network are starting to be established. For instance, there is a group of about 12 young curators in Brazil of ages ranging between 29 and 35 that have taken part of the program in different cities and that now are meeting periodically out of their own need and desire. They have mentioned they were missing the support and level of dialogue that they had during the intensive and have organized themselves to have these periodical meetings. We are now in dialogue with them to see how ICI can support their efforts and respond to their needs. But we're happy to see that they are taking the lead in creating this regional network. So it's interesting to see this kind of shift of now having not a bottom down, but like really the network taking care of itself and like breaking into regional sections. The diversity of the ICI network signals that a number of the issues respond to the local specificity of the context where the curators operate. Engaging in critical dialogue with a group of curators from around the globe allows each of them to encounter the issues that are relevant to them at the local level, but also across national lines. Issues such as the impact of liberal economies, the ecological and social crash produced by the extraction of natural resources, civil liberties and civil rights, migration and displacement, inequality, labor, gentrification, land ownership, just to name a few. This highly international network is indeed the sum of a number of individual perspectives rooted in the local, a conglomeration of micropolitical practices that have a national and regional impact, but at the same time, they have a desire to be global. I'm going to leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. I'll give the word directly to you.
Yeah, thank you. So thank you, Rikke, and all the organizations for the invitation to come to speak and present the activities of IKT, the International Association for Curators of Contemporary Art, in this Congress in Copenhagen. And thank you for my fellow colleague María for presenting ICI, well, almost the same age, the organizations, but slightly different base on how we organize our activities, but I see a lot of similarities, at least in the wishes, not necessarily in the ways how we do it, but in kind of like what are the main aims that we want to reach with our work, with our members, and with your participants of the intensive courses. I'm a curator based in Helsinki, here in Northern Europe, kind of like a popular, when thinking of the population of the country, almost the same size as Denmark, at 5.5 million. So we are talking about a very small community of people and a very small, also contemporary art, let's say, audience, but also a scene. So kind of like coming from this perspective, for me, network like IKT offers a really big input also in my own work as a curator in a museum, which operates both with Finnish but also with international art. What I would like to do today is just shortly present the association to you, and then also to just somehow try to wrap it up. What are the kind of like the main points within our activities, and then how it kind of like comes back to my own work. So not necessarily talking so much about the work in KIASMA, but then of course feel free to ask later on if you have a need for that. So IKT is slightly older than ICI, so formed in '73, but actually just to shortly give some background about the association, it was already in late '60s. There was a need in Germany among a lot of people to create a platform to discuss about the profession of curating, but they didn't speak about curators at that time. They spoke about exhibition makers. And these exhibition makers came together and wanted to discuss not only the best practices of the work, how to do exhibitions, but then also on the profession. And so it was a combination of both very theoretical, but then also very practical issues. And one of the main themes was that many of the people involved in the first phases of IKT, the Internationale Kunstausstellungsleiterung Tagung. I always hate the complete German name, so I prefer to go with the English one. So it was that many of these people were working with Kunstvereins and Kunsthalles, not in the museums, and they were facing very different kind of challenges in that context, because it was already their own position in such organizations was somehow precarious occasionally, but then also they were lacking the knowledge of creating international standard exhibitions, because they were many of them fresh out of universities and lacking the kind of curatorial education that nowadays is available in many places around the world. And even in Finland nowadays, since 4 or 5 years, we have had a curatorial program, but we were kind of like really late coming in Finland, for example, in this trend of education. So it started as a very informal platform between these exhibition makers, but in the beginning it was very German, or just concentrating on the German-speaking areas in Europe, and then they had occasional and some international members from Sweden, from the Netherlands, but it was for almost 20 years a very German organization. And so, I would say that it has been also very important in the European context in creating kind of like the profession of curators, or how we know it nowadays. So it has also had that kind of like an importance in the whole sense of creating that. And then from the very beginning, what has been important in IKT with these different kind of informal meetings that then on have developed into our annual congresses has been a kind of like an exhibition market. So that not just sharing the knowledge and sharing ideas about curating, but then also really sharing projects, so finding partners and creating projects together. And this is something that is still going on. So still today, IKT is a place for people to meet and exchange ideas and projects and to share knowledge, and especially to broaden the networks. And I would say that the importance of IKT is definitely the network that it creates, and kind of like a platform for discussion, because in many places, as you also mentioned, there is not necessarily such kind of like a amount of people that you would really engage and create a critical discussion on curating. So then at least once a year, or nowadays we try to do it also a bit more often, you can offer people a platform and a place for discussion on curating, and not necessarily in the Biennale or art fair context, which is also kind of like very contested with the program wisely. So kind of like just to keep it to the basics and concentrate on one thing at a time. And as I said earlier, that IKT was from the beginning very European and especially very German organization. It was really only until in the 1990s when we started to get more international and a more wider membership, and or kind of like a variety of members from different countries and even different continents. And I think it started mostly with Saskia Bos being selected as, I think, the first female president of the organization in '99 in Lisbon when the Congress was there. And from there on, it has become to be more like ICOM, CIMAM, and ICA, resembling those international associations, but being very unhierarchical from the beginning, being very unbureaucratic, and then it's always based on voluntary work. So this, of course, is a kind of like thing that also gives us some limitations in what we can do. So we are not an office, and we don't have any paid staff who are doing. So everybody is working on voluntary basis. Our lovely members are here in April in our previous Congress in Vienna, at the MAC, wonderful, their old kind of like a lecture room at the Museum of Applied Arts in Vienna. So we have nowadays over 500 members in the association, but we have a little over 300 what we call active members. So we have a lot of sleeping members, a bit older members. They might be members since 70s, but are not necessarily so active anymore. And they come mostly from different kind of non-profit, non-commercial art exhibition spaces, museums, and different kind of, we have a lot of independent curators and freelance curators. I think that's a growing number of members, and it's around 20 new members per year what we get. And they come mostly from Eastern and Western Europe, also from Japan and Australia and Americas. So both South and Northern America. But for example, to my knowledge, we still don't have any members from the African continent. So kind of like we still do have a lot of work with becoming more international. But what has been a joy when I've been working myself active in the association since, I've been member since 2006 and active really since 2009. I first organized one Congress in Helsinki and Tallinn at that year, and then 2011 I started to work with the board of IKT, so now I'm on my second round in the board. And what has been a joy to notice is that our members are nowadays so international that they bring kind of like the internationality and the knowledge from different regions within our meetings and our congresses and different kind of other activities that we organize. So it has been a pleasure to notice that they bring the international art world also within the IKT context in many ways. And then just shortly about the aims. So the main aim is still to facilitate and stimulate debate and discussion concerning conception and realization of contemporary art exhibitions and the curatorial profession. So it's very much still working with both how to develop the profession. Occasionally we are also asked to act as some sort of a lobbyist towards different issues relation to the precarious situation of independent curators, regarding the rights of the curators, for example, towards what they create in their work, be that either text material or concepts. So what are their rights when you're proposing or kind of like addressing a museum with a proposal. And then also issues related to, for example, the ethics of your own work. So kind of like how to deal with the curatorial ethics in relation to working with artists and in relation to working with different kind of institutions. So it's very practical issues, but then also towards kind of like how we perceive our profession in this day. And then, for example, when we organize our events, we usually try to organize them kind of like outside of any bigger exhibitions and something in order to be really sure that we can dive into in-depth discussions and not to be bothered with other issues. But so practical and more theoretical discussion on curating. And so the main function, as we just have a office with president and a secretary, so we're really not able to support with loads of work. So our main functions are to create the network, to offer certain platforms for discussions per year, and so kind of like we're pretty much limited to those options as being a voluntary association. But what is the main objective is the annual conference that we've been doing since 70s, and it has been traveling mostly in Europe in different places, also slightly overseas, and this is still the main thing that we do. And the idea in a yearly Congress is always to not just to have we always have a certain topic for a symposia that we deal with, be that either theoretical or more practical. But then it's also that we really want to together get to know the scene where we are visiting, a city or an area, and from different levels. So not just visiting main institutions, but it's also visiting non-profit spaces, doing a lot of studio visits. We are usually kind of like 100, 140 people, so it's not that necessarily easy to kind of like handle how you do it, but we have always a support from the local members in a place where we take the Congress, and we always come up with really nice solutions of taking smaller groups of people and being able to delve into the different levels of the scene in one specific city. And in the congresses, we've been dealing in a symposia with very kind of like practical issues. So this year in Vienna, my board colleague Katalin Timar from Budapest put up a program on financing in crisis, which was partially in relation to her own situation in Hungary, where most of the institutions are currently sort of taken over by the right-wing government, and they don't really have a liberty to do what kind of like more alternative programs. So now it's interestingly that it's the commercial gallery side which is more supporting a lot of alternative things happening in Budapest. So it was a mixture of artists, researchers and curators speaking about financing in crisis. You mentioned Northern Ireland, and Miguel Amado, my former colleague in the IKT board, also for our Congress there last year, put together a program in curating in conflicting zones. We've been talking about, in past years, about the values in curating. We've been talking about the mediation in contemporary art and how it's in relation to curating, and also about the politics of belonging, because then when the Europe opened with the EU and when the Eastern European countries became part of the EU, they haven't always shared the same feeling of belonging to the whole EU family that we, for example, in the Western part have felt. So kind of like it's often the topics for congresses come from our members, and they have certain topics and issues that they want to discuss. And we've been also asked a lot to do something else during the year than just the Congress. And then a couple of years ago, we came up with an idea to create labs. And this is something that IKT Labs is a completely kind of like an open idea for our members to come up with a proposal of a topic that they want to deal with. So for example, here in Copenhagen a couple of years ago, there was a lab organized by local IKT members on the kind of like what is the situation of the Kunsthalles nowadays in Europe. We have had a lab in Paris, also organized by our members, discussing on curating African art. We had a lab in Rennes, and also kind of like an event one-day event in Mexico City. So kind of like it's our members come with their expertise and with their international connections and topics as well. And nowadays we also host a couple of times a year informal gatherings when we meet together with the board. So then we also try to meet our local members in certain cities. So it's very kind of like grassroots thing, and then it always comes up in the Congress every year. And I'll just very shortly, lastly, introduce. So nowadays, our presidency is in Germany, in Osnabrück, since last year, 2014, in the spring, when the General Assembly of our organization. So it's the members who always choose who is the next president and who is the board. So it's very democratic. We do the decisions in a democratic way. And now it's Julia Draganovic in Osnabrück who is running the organization for the next 3 years. And we do it so that we change it usually every 3 years in order to keep it international. So the office always travels with the new president from place to another. So we've been in Vaduz, we've been in Luxembourg and in Paris and now in Osnabrück, of all the places in the world. And for my own work, just to quickly, as I referred in the beginning, kind of like when working in a very small context and in a very small art scene, even in a country where you have a very small language group of your own, so kind of like not being even completely Scandinavian, but rather part of the Nordic countries, but not Scandinavian. It's super important for the work to have such an international network and be able to link with people there. And it's for practical issues, it's for creating projects together, but then it's also kind of like the intellectual mindset where you can engage into discussion at least once a year for 4 days in depth. Thank you.
Thank you too. Interesting. When hearing both of you, one question that kind of, maybe it's actually 2 questions, but one thing that popped up in my mind is the idea of networks being inclusive. And then being part of networks myself, I realized that they're not at all always very inclusive. There are lots of different criteria. In fact, they're sometimes quite excluding because you need to feed into you need to be a curator, or you need to be a museum director, or you need to be a modern museum if it's CMAM, or you need to have these different criteria. And at the very same time, it's 2015, and the whole composition of the art scene is being rewritten while we're here. Yesterday we killed kind of contemporary. We would
and now you want to kill the network?
No, I don't want to kill the network. But my question is, how do we ensure networks to be actually more including and much more receptive to the transformations in society? I can give you an example. I was a museum director, and my head of communication in 2007 wanted to go to an international conference for heads of communication. And she came back with a lot of good ideas about how to communicate 2007. 2007, 80% of all cultural communication was on paper. It was flyers, posters, postcards, everything was small programs, but it was in paper. Then somebody invented the smartphone. And the world has never, it's down there somewhere, the world has never been itself again. Today, 80% of all cultural communication takes place via smartphones. And it's not push anymore, it's pull. And it's not me to decide, it's them to decide. And it's co-creative, it's participatory. So how do you guys, running networks with the intention of being inclusive, adapt into the transformations of reality? How do you make sure that your networks are actually very inclusive and are, sorry contemporary in the sense that they reflect what is going on in our societies. Maria.
Well, I think I'm reading your question in two different ways. One, like really trying to think about being really inclusive and thinking about the audiences and thinking about the people that might be wondering, well, what is a curator? And in that way, I think that it is okay to be slightly exclusive or like more specific, because I think that the two organizations, IKT and ICI, are very specific in the sense that 40 years ago, someone decided that it was important to think about curators. I mean, like, the institutions itself are already thinking about the audiences. Curators are thinking about the artists and following their practices. But it was a very specific moment to think, well, how do we start supporting the work of curators and providing opportunities for them to have a conversation and to develop their thinking? So I think in that way, the network of ICI is really focusing towards that. And the public programs that we do in many cases also do that. Although, of course, the moment you invite a curator to talk about their practice, they are going to be talking about artists and they're going to be talking about how to engage with audience and beyond. So it's kind of like this double side kind of thing. So I think in that sense, it's important for us, and I wanted to focus on the curatorial intensive as like the main source of this network that we're building. But we have different platforms to communicate with people. One of the platforms that lives on our website, that it's called the Curators Network, a little bit redundant, can actually be joined by other people as well. They can pay a fee, and curators, so it's actually bigger. We have the 300 alumni plus 200 people from different parts of the world that are part of the network. And in that digital platform, we post curatorial opportunities, job opportunities, residencies. We have a space where people can have a dialogue, so like an online forum. We share materials that we're reading or things that we're discussing in the closed door setting. So it is kind of a way of becoming a little bit more open, but again, open for curators. And I think that there's always this triggering effect of the conversations that happen that then permeate to the larger community through the works of the members of the network. So I don't know if that responds what you were trying to get at.
From a personal perspective, at least, I think that networks to a large degree can be incredibly exclusive, but for good reasons, which is that providing a hub for people to think through questions collectively, but all of those constituent partners having a kind of vested interest in the subject matter or having a vested interest in the future of curating, be it curating or another kind of network, a network for communication experts, for example. And they exist within every industry, networks of some sort. And actually, even without inscribing the idea of a network, this in itself is a network that we're operating in right now. There are certain members, there are certain parties here, and there are exclusions, inevitably. But I think that on the note of what you guys were sort of describing in relation to the way in which your organizations work, one of the things I picked up on is that you mentioned that you had to be a curator with a 3-year track record in order to become an ICI participant. Mm-hmm. The same way, I mean, it seems to me, you being a PhD recipient and the director of your organization being a doctor, is it not to some extent about a kind of professionalization or creating specialists who can in some way talk about very nuanced issues, but perhaps issues that may be distant from the very urgent and pragmatic questions being faced by artists within the field? I think it's interesting that you mentioned a platform that is about showing job opportunities, etc. But I'm curious to know specifically with your project how it actually enables opportunities for artists or those who are inevitably connected to the practice of curating, but who are not curators themselves.
Yeah. Well, artists as curators has been one issue that we often discuss. Well, our membership procedure is such that you need to have 2 recommenders from these 300 plus active members to recommend you to become an IKT member, and then it's just a kind of like a letter of motivation to show. So it's not very complicated, I would say, and then it's also that, for example, we within the board and also our active members, they're doing a lot of kind of like spreading information, and when they meet an interesting curator and think that might kind of like bring a more value within the association, so they often propose and you should apply, and that's not too complicated. But what is an issue that we are constantly more and more discussing within the congresses, within the board meetings, is related to artists as curators, and then to the commercial side, because it's getting so blurred. So this is kind of like coming the more challenging, and I would say even more the challenging, the commercial side, how it's mingling through curators, curating, for example, private collections, and then occasionally curating for galleries. So this gray area between the commercial and non-profit is, I would say, more challenging for us when kind of like trying to pinpoint where kind of like the limits of the membership go, or who can be the member. But then what I think certain kind of exclusiveness is kind of like needed, and as you said also kind of like that when you want to keep the discussion in a certain kind of like level and focus on a certain discussion. But we do have some members who have had kind of like the background is more in artistic practice, but then who have really kind of like slipped into the curating and are doing more that. But there are sometimes kind of like slight difficulties how to kind of like pinpoint there, which is the actual practice.
And I'm just curious also to know finally, with the relationship between the role of the curator being one that's inevitably becoming more precarious and difficult to locate, especially when it comes to the role of the freelance or the independent curator. Why do you think it is that networks like yours are expanding at the rate that they are, and that you're doing international programs, and that you yourself are seeing an expansion within your membership, when people know full well that it's a job, a profession that often doesn't offer much reward?
Well, I think, for example, in our case, it's for many members, they want to use the network in their work, especially if they are freelancers. But then, of course, it's sometimes that they really need it as a support, kind of like it's an association that can support their work when thinking of kind of like the values of curatorial work, of thinking of kind of like the how different factors in the field recognize your work as a curator. So they also kind of like are searching for this background, and the association can give for them kind of like recognition and making the work as you do. You do make the work of curator more visible and more understandable, and not just kind of like that it's some strange thing happening up there.
And I think that what made ICI think about creating the curatorial intensive, this specific platform, was exactly the changing role of curatorship, of curators that were not that were wearing many hats, that were like really doing different things at the same time, and that the moment you start moving and visiting the different contexts, it really changes the way people perceive themselves. Like, we'll meet someone in Ecuador, and they will say, well, no, but I'm not a curator. I'm a cultural producer. I'm an organizer. I do exhibitions, but I'm not a curator. So even demystifying the who can claim the word, I think is very interesting the moment you start moving to different contexts. So I think that has been kind of the one of the thriving impulses to create this program. So it goes together. It goes together with understanding how the role is shifting, and at the same time, the moment you start understanding that a bunch of things can be included. That it doesn't have to be the person who went to the MFA of curating, the one that can claim the word, but that there has to be some understanding of some self-reflexivity on the practice at the same time. That is. So I think that balance is something I find interesting.
It has to do both with the changes in the global community, in the global society, but I think it also has to changes in how the perception of the word has actually been changed within the framework of Western tradition. Paul Goodwin touched on that yesterday and used the Tate example of including the former educational officers in the group of curators, so that curating became much more than just dealing with the artworks themselves isolated in a specific context. It was also about how they were disseminated, communicated, dialogued about. So,
but also I don't know if that is happening in the context here, but in the U.S. now everything is curating.
Yeah.
Organizing the retailer window is curating. Editors are no editors anymore. There are curators of pages. It's like it has become. So I think it's interesting. If before it was really a matter of like you will say I'm a curator and people will say what. Now you have to make the distinction. I'm a curator of art, and so it's not read as a curator of a menu or something. So I think there's a change there that is also quite interesting.
There's a question.
Paul has a question for us.
Hi, I thought it's just a very simple question, although I guess it's also quite a broad question. I was really struck in the last session when Ibrahim Mahama kind of, with a lot of clarity, said that his work really took off when he realized he wanted to be an artist of the 21st century. Right? An artist. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah. No.
Yeah. So Ibrahim was talking about this idea of being an artist of the 21st century, and he seemed to be very confident about claiming that space of the century as being an artist. And I wondered, just really briefly, although it's an open question, where is the vision for curators of the 21st century from the perspective of your organizations? Because as you said, there's lots of discourse about curating, there's lots of conferences about curating, there's lots of discussions about curating. We talk constantly among ourselves, but we're, in a way, as networks, as organizations that are dealing with this on a broader issue, where do you see as the vision for where curatorial practice has to be, in the 21st century?
Well, that's an easy question. Thank you. No, it's really interesting and challenging, I think, and I think there is no one way to respond to that, because I think that the context really informs the way people are thinking about curatorial practice. And although there is a shared interest, if I want to generalize in terms of working closely with an audience and working closely with the community, I think there's an interest also in understanding the history of exhibition making and of really bringing light to moments in art history that probably are invisible and recovering those figures. I don't know if I can say what is the common ground. I mean, it's also, there's a number of curators that, especially in places where there is very little infrastructure, that they see their role as curators to create infrastructure. And that can be creating a space to have residency for artists or find resources so they can give money to artists to do production. So I think the roles are multiple, and I think that probably that multiplicity is the sign of the moment, instead of having just one single vision of what the curator was that maybe existed 100 years ago. Now I think that multiplicity is probably the sign of the time.
I'm not sure either if I have kind of like any clear answer on where it's going, but at least in my own practice, one thing that I try to do when thinking of where this should be going, my profession as well, and for me curating is very much being in collaboration with the artist. So of course, for example, for me it is very much to look what young artists are doing and trying to respond to that, which is not that easy when working in a bigger institution, which is kind of like not as big as Tate, but kind of like in a Finnish scale, it's like Tate. So that's always a challenge, but at least to be open to that and try to somehow bring it also in the institution and try and kind of like nurture it in a way that the institution doesn't kill it, kind of like the big setup. But then what is sometimes frustrating is that what you see outside in non-profit spaces, in artisan spaces, and kind of like you become interested in something, and then you want to bring it into institution, and then the artist himself is kind of like just fascinated with the white cube situation, and then kind of like somehow goes to the traditional. And that is sometimes frustrating for a curator, because then this sort of an aura of an institution is sometimes kind of like that. It's difficult even when you try to help them to somehow challenge it. But I think one important, at least for me, is to follow what young artists are doing and where they want to take contemporary art, or if not contemporary, but where they want to take art.
We have one last question, Marius.
Hi, my name is Marius and I'm a visual artist. Obviously, as curators, your job is to work directly with artists, but I think that given your positions and you know, these networks that you have created for curators, you are uniquely situated to create very strong collaborative situations, and then this kind of echoes what Niels and Osei were asking. Do you have any tools, or are you working on any tools that will not necessarily include active members into the association that are not curators themselves, but rather facilitating a way to bring your networks of curators and networks of artists or exhibition spaces or other networks that are amalgamated in the same way that yours are, and create opportunities of collaboration in that way. For example, you know, for me as an artist, if I wanted to engage one of your associations with a project, and I felt that perhaps curators that worked in different ways or in different locations or within different networks might be able to present it in different ways, are there tools in place for someone like myself to do that?
Well, I'm not sure if I completely got your question, but for example, within our organization, we have also many members in IKT who are working with artist residencies, so they are not necessarily curating that many shows per year or even every year, but they are kind of like developing their curatorial practice within residency programs, either their own or working for a residency program, and I think that is definitely one interesting point, because then, for example, for my own work, I think the production side of the curatorial work is very important. So it's not just the conceptual side, but it's very much also hands-on working with the artist and working with the production of a new work and kind of like very practical help in the actual work. But when we, for example, land with this certain place where we have the annual conference, so it's usually always a place where you hear about different kind of, for example, artist initiatives and different models of doing exhibitions and creating kind of like a very grassroots organizational work. And I think that's, for example, always has been a pleasure to come up with different kind of forms on how to develop. But I don't know if you...
Well, I think with ICI what is interesting is I just presented this one specific platform that creates on its own a certain kind of network. And the word makes it sound like it's more cohesive when it's actually just like more these contact of different interests of people. It's not really, doesn't have really a membership package that comes to it and explains why you're part of it or not. So I like this idea of this thing being more open-ended than it might sound right now. But that's just one side of the things that ICI do. We also do exhibitions, and we work with curators, and we produce exhibitions also internally, where we work with a number of artists who are also part of this larger network. So that's also a way where it becomes more open for people like you, that you're saying that you're an artist. We also try to invite at least one artist to speak in the intensives every time. So I was mentioning to someone, we had Shudha Sengupta from Rax Media Collective that presented in the intensive in Marrakesh, both as an artist but also as a curator. And many of the people that are part of our curatorial intensive alumni wear the two hats. They are artists and they are also curators, and they fluctuate between one and the other. So I don't know. I really don't know how to respond to your question. I think is a really good one and challenging one. But I just wanted to mention that in this larger cloud, to not call it a network, that ICI has, there's a number of artists that are part of it and are an active part of it.
I will let that be the conclusive words. And by doing that, I'll say thank you to Maria and thank you to Kati.
Thank you to you.